Good evening. Welcome to the Lupina Center for Spirituality, Healthcare, and Ethics. And the center is extraordinarily excited to present this evening Professor Oliver O'Donovan, who will be speaking to us. Professor O'Donovan is the author of 12 books. He's the editor and translator of a number of other ones, and the author of dozens, if not hundreds of articles. Some of his major works include 2 books in political theology, The Desire of the Nations, published in 1996, and The Ways of Judgment, published 2005. He also published a small but very important book in medical ethics called Begotten or Made, back in 1984. He's also published a major and continuing, a book that continues to be very important on St. Augustine, the problem of self-love in St. Augustine. He's also published a number of books specifically for concerns of the Anglican Communion, works on war and deterrence, and a number of other topics. Tonight we're very happy to have him returning to questions related to medical ethics, particularly questions at the foundations of the practice of clinical medicine. And his lecture tonight is entitled Utility, Practical Reason, and Care. Professor O'Donovan, many years ago, taught here in Toronto at Wycliffe College from 1977 to 1982. He then took up a post as Regius Professor of Moral and Pastoral Theology at the University of Oxford, for which he taught it 25 years. And in an extended conversation earlier today, I was reminded just how much I have learned from him. He may not think I've learned that much, but I certainly think I have. So both for personal and for intellectual and all kinds of other reasons, I'm very excited to welcome Professor O'Donovan. Please welcome him.
Thank you, John, for that very generous welcome. It's always a joy to be back in Toronto. It's a special joy to be back in Regis College today, which in its previous incarnation in another place in the city I knew quite well and had very happy relations with when I taught here over 30 years ago, but the less said about the length of time, the better, and let us consider the subject before us. I'm inviting you to think about 2 practical concepts which govern the way we think about medical care, pastoral oversight, and the range of activities that lie at the heart of the Lupina Center's concerns. And those concepts are utility and care. And in between those two, holding them together, as I think, I invite you to consider a third concept, which is the traditional Christian term for virtue in deliberation, and that is prudence. Utility and care can best be illustrated, I think, from 2 distinct tasks which come together and are bound in one practice in clinical medicine. On the one hand, the pastoral task of support and fellowship for the sick. On the other, the technical task of treating and modifying the bodily condition of illness. When we speak of care, our attention is focused on a relation to the sick person. When we speak of utility, it is focused on the procedures of the treatment we invoke in that relation. And when we speak of clinical medicine, that is to say, literally, medicine practiced by the bedside, we have in view both care and utility, but so ordered that the care of the patient is the end and the utility of the treatment the means, and not vice versa. If clinical medicine as a practice is not illusory, the two concepts are not incompatible, nor are they redundant. But as in any complex practical undertaking, the temptation arises of conceiving their relation improperly, allowing one concept to get the whip hand over the other. And such a mistake casts its long shadow over a bureaucratic society such as our own. Historically, philosophers have spoken of utilitarianism, the name given to it by its major philosophical advocate, J.S. Mill, the view that the various duties of utility and care can properly be ordered and assessed under a concept of overall utility. Of the two concepts, utility must have the ruling regnant function. Let's try and illustrate the problems that arise in a very simple case. There's a poem by Bertolt Brecht about the 1930s depression in New York City, a poem on which Hans Ulrich has reflected tellingly. To build a makeshift night shelter each evening on the street to offer cover and protection to the homeless from the elements, reflects Brecht, does nothing much to overcome the evils of capitalism. Yet, after all, it is a comfort. And that is a comforting reflection in itself. But what moral claim can such a comforting reflection have upon us? What if somebody seriously challenges the utility of the night shelter by appealing to longer-term consequences, putting before us the argument that building the shelter each night on the street simply prolongs the depression by enabling capitalism to escape its social liabilities? Does a defense of the shelter require us to rule out all longer-term consequences and allow no duties except to the immediate and pressing present need of the homeless? Does it require us to rule out aggregate consequences and allow no duties except to the particular needy who present themselves to us on this street tonight? Both these strategies of argument have been deployed to fend off the harsh utilitarian prescription that if capitalism reaps its true reward and the homeless die on the street, visibly in sight of everybody, the result will be more productive overall. But we're actually likely to be quite dissatisfied with the cry that the needy are here and now. At least if that cry is erected into some kind of universal doctrine to cover all sorts of situations. A care that simply could not accommodate any appeal to an anticipated future would be a very curious care. Imagine being told that whenever you give some coins to a beggar in a certain quarter of town, as soon as you turn your back, you expose him or her to the risk of violence and robbery. That consideration, if you could verify it, would not be such as it would be caring to ignore for very long. And a care that could not take any cognizance of the classes of human need, that could not, for example, envisage founding a home for homeless children as a class, but insisted on confining itself to the needs of this child or that child as a homeless child happened to present him or herself, would be a limited, even a morally questionable kind of care. So the issue comes back then to the ways in which we can conceive the values of utility and the values of care in their proper relationship and order. Now, I beg your patience for a few minutes in looking back to the founding document of utilitarianism, which you probably read in the schoolroom, simply because it illustrates the conceptual problems rather clearly. The creed which accepts as the foundation of morals utility or the greatest happiness principle, wrote John Stuart Mill, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness, he goes on, is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. Now that is the large headline statement of principle at the beginning of utilitarianism. It's not the better known principle associated with the work, which is the distributive principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And that, of course, is something rather different from the principle as stated at the beginning. But it is the one I've quoted that is the foundation of his doctrine. A sovereign principle of right and wrong which, without appealing to any transcendent moral authority or to any criterion not perspicuously present in the bare facticity of what we do, pretends to overrule all intuitive and conventional judgments of moral worth and impose on us obligations to utility that override not only our subjective inclinations, but even our beliefs and convictions. What is its cutting edge? Well, apparently, its cutting edge is in the main clause. Actions are right in proportion as they promote happiness. But actually, that's no more than a recognizable version, perhaps an inversion, if the truth be told, of a very long-hallowed Christian eudaimonism that we can find formulated very clearly both in St. Augustine and St. Thomas. The real innovations in the Millian proposal occur in the introductory and corollary clauses, before and after that central statement. And the first suggests that there is an equivalence of meaning between two formulations. Accepting as the foundations of morals, as the foundation of morals, utility, and holding that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness. Now, this equivalence implies the mutual definitions of two pairs of terms. Morals defines right action, and right action defines morals. And utility is defined as promoting happiness, and happiness is defined as what utility promotes. And those are fairly restrictive definitions, if you think about it. Straight off, no scope is allowed for a morality that conceives itself as based on virtue, nor of a right action that is merely technically right and doesn't lay claim to moral rightness, nor for a utility based on self-preservation or sustainability, nor for a happiness that might be a function of self-realization, self-expression, participation in a higher good, or any of the other things which we might associate with the notion of happiness. So to these very restrictive definitions, there is then added a two-headed definition of happiness as understood, as promoted by utility, namely, pleasure and the absence of pain. And these two expressions are treated as synonymous, as are pain and the absence of pleasure. And that too is surely very counterintuitive, because it might commonly be thought that the absence of pain is no more than the absence of pain. and isn't pleasure at all. But the synonymity gives Mill two strong advantages. It allows him to conceive of a single scale with pleasure at the positive end and pain at the negative end, so that all utilities can be ranged on that scale, subject to direct quantitative commensuration, and so allows him to transfer by implication the immediate sensory self-evidence of pain and its perceptible degrees to pleasure and even to happiness. I know whether I'm in pain, and I know whether the pain is getting better or getting worse. So we immediately conclude I know whether I'm having pleasure, and I know whether the pleasure is getting better or getting worse. And then we conclude, without further ado, I know whether I'm happy, and I know whether the happiness is getting better or getting worse. But it doesn't follow at all, does it? I mean, what is true of pain, immediately and obviously, is not immediately and obviously true either of pleasure or of happiness. It must be, just for the record, added that Mill notoriously did not stand by this single-scale conception, but introduced somewhere halfway through his essay the idea of higher pleasures as opposed to lower pleasures. But that's all schoolroom stuff. Let's leave Mill at this point. We have entertained him long enough, and attend to the substantive discussion of the issue of utility that he's raised and left our civilization with. The concept of the utility of an action, then, is that of a tendency to produce a more pleasurable, less painful state of affairs than some alternative state of affairs. Note that this is not a function of the act's eventual outcome, which may go one way or the other, nor is it a function of the envisaged outcome by the person who performed the act, which may have been well envisaged or badly envisaged. It is a function of the productive tendency of the act as such. Now, we've already drawn attention to the formal structure which recalls that of classical moral eudaimonism, with its concept of right action being in a mediating relation to an end that is described as blessedness or happiness. Let's highlight now in a preliminary way a few obvious salient differences between these two concepts. First, utility is supposed to be an objective relation of an act to an end, a tendency that is objectively attributable to the act, to produce a tendency to produce greater or lesser happiness. And that objectively attributable tendency determines its rightness or wrongness without any further qualification. Now, in classical Christian thought, the relation of means to end was a subjective one as well as an objective one. Augustine thought that the difference of subjective intention could give an identical objective deed completely different moral values. So moral inquiry for Augustine involved a very high degree, sometimes painfully high degree, of self-scrutiny and self-knowledge, understanding one's own motives, and so on. Now, obviously, the principle of utility simply dispenses with all that. The subject of moral thinking and what he or she thinks that is the end of the action really has shrunk almost out of sight. It is, in fact, recognizably the same subject as we know from scientific thinking. An ideal observer, an ideal calculator, looking at the world, measuring the potential of various different courses with no personal location, no position in it. Utilitarianism has no idea, we may say, of the agent perspective on an action. The fact that if I'm about to do it, it looks rather different from you looking on at me. Moral judgment is very important to Mill, but it's essentially public judgment, rendered on actual or possible states of affairs in the world that actions may or may not realize. So moral judgment is more like a critic's judgment than an actor's judgment, more evaluative than deliberative, more concerned with that's okay or that's no good than what am I to do, how am I to achieve it. It is, one might say, a typically post-Christian moral construction. A sovereign principle laying claim on practical reason, just as God's command used to do, but abstractly now, on its own rational authority, not in the service of world, of history, or the fate of the soul, not in the service of anything. Just a sovereign principle. That's the first difference. The second difference is this. Utility, as so conceived, is determined by the immediate transparency of the end of the action. Happiness is the absence of suffering. While Christian thought had spoken of happiness as the vision of God, transcendent, and so undescribable, to be conceived in faith and in hope. Which acts may tend to it could not therefore be known by direct inspection, only by such wisdom as natural or revealed law offered. The transparency of happiness in utilitarianism has caused a good deal of unease, not only among its theological critics, but among its non-theological critics too. It's worth pausing over one line of criticism which we often encounter today, and we may christen it loosely, and I hope without prejudice, as late liberal. Now, the late liberal supports very strongly Mill's distributive principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number, but demurs at the claim that happiness is pleasure or the absence of pain. The late liberal thinks that pleasure may not, after all, be the absence of pain. Some people seem to take pleasure in pain. People take pleasure, certainly, in very different things, and we have no right a priori to say they mustn't take pleasure in pain. Happiness, too, may not be the same as pleasure, for pleasure is reasonably predictable in the general run of cases, while other people's happiness and unhappiness seems often mysterious, even quite contrary. So it appears that a universal criterion of happiness could only be, on this reckoning, a purely formal criterion, needing supplementary principles from other sources to fill it with any content whatsoever. And in the late liberal tradition, this need has normally been supplied by individual free choice, theoretically absolute. People are made happy for all practical purposes by what they tell you when they are sent their voting slips or their opinion poll formulae to fill in. By what they tell you makes them happy. That is, at any rate, the thinking of the British government at present about the subject of happiness. As you will see, the British maintain a certain tradition of, I'd say, ground-level philosophical reflection on these subjects. So much for, one might say, the late liberal. Christian thinkers, on the other hand, are neither as confident in the self-evidence of happiness as the utilitarian account appears to be, nor as sceptical as some late liberal alternatives to it. They're inclined to agree, at any rate, that whatever may be reliably said about things that tend to happiness will not be a self-evident equation of happiness with some empirical state. Happiness is having an income over so many $1,000 a year and so on. A community may know much about what will promote people's welfare. It may know quite a lot about how to take pleasure in things. And it may even have sound guidance to give on what will conduce to happiness. Yet, happiness is and always will be, for every human being, an object of inquiry. and search, an existential horizon, not an observable and measurable state that can simply be commensurated. A third and briefer difference. Utility is posited as a productive relation of an action to an end of action. The value of an action lies in the value of what it produces. Action is conceived as a making of a state of affairs, rather than as a performance. And here the difference is very sharp. Can we really say that all action can be conceived on the model of the work of a craftsman whose operations under the control of his skill are converted directly into an objective product, and the value of the product is the value of the exercise of the craft? There are in utilitarianism space for other criteria, to be sure, but always as subordinate to this overarching conception that an act will be justified by its outcome, or the outcome to which it tends of itself. And the classical Christian account has supposed a very different model of acting, both more expressive and more performative, and a range of criteria for judging action that is not only future-oriented, but past and present-oriented too. Justice, which is always a past-reflective criterion. Justice is owed to what has come to be or been done. Obedience to laws, intelligence in interpretation of circumstances, and so on. An act must be judged not only by the tendencies it has within itself, but by its form, by its agency, by its context in the world. Each of these, in different ways, a primary determinant of an act's validity. Let us move on from there now. The 3 points of contrast I've identified in this very sketchy way display the concept of utility as interested exclusively in forward-looking features of an act. When a struggle breaks out between care and utility, as in the hypothetical example of the objection to the night shelter on the street in the Depression, what gives rise to this struggle is the complexity of factors that weigh in on the situation, any one of which might seem important and at risk of being forgotten. The defender of utility is anxious that tendencies in actions to produce certain outcomes should not be lost sight of. The defender of care is anxious that the immediate demands of the human relations in which we stand should not be lost sight of. There is a certain tension between demands laid on us by what is and demands laid on us by what we anticipate or should be able to anticipate. Now, negotiating that tension is precisely the work that was classically assigned to the virtue of prudence in the Christian tradition. I quote St. Augustine's summary of the virtue of prudence. A forward-looking intention must be linked to a backward-looking memory. In exploring what the notion of prudence has to contribute here, then, let's look first at the thought of the future in a moral reason governed by prudence. The future can be envisaged in a number of ways, and that's inevitably so, since the only knowledge we have of the future is indirect knowledge. Let's make an initial and rather obvious contrast between the thought of the future in practical intention, which envisages a point of time immediately in front of us as we venture upon an action, the time that opens up from right where we are now into the immediate future that allows us to bring our action forth in it. There is that concept of the future, and there is a quite different way of thinking of the future of a speculative or imaginative type. Now, the future of intention exists wholly in our practical reasoning. The action we premeditate has no reality in the world until we have performed it. And then, when we have performed it, it's no longer an intention. It has come into the world from the intending mind. Its validity as a future prospect consists not in whether it's real or is going to happen, but in whether it is, and one has to use this composite phrase to get it right, whether it is to be realized. Speculation, on the other hand, is interested in the future that will in fact transpire, the future that will become future generations' past. That future, to whatever extent we can speak of it, is real, part of the world. By definition, it is what is going to happen. But of course, we have no direct cognitive access to it. We guess at it. We see fragmentary aspects of it. We conjecture at it. We project from trends which we see persisting in the present into the future. But however certain to continue these trends may or may not be, they cannot be summed up in such a way that they could support something like a joined-up narrative of the future, as historical evidence and recollection may support a joined-up narrative of the past. Even the extraordinarily confident statements about what the future will contain that meet one along the corridors of every international airport these days by courtesy of the Hong Kong-Shanghai Banking Corporation cannot be joined up into anything coherent. Hong Kong-Shanghai Banking Corporation reckon they know and want you to know that they know quite a lot of things about the future, but how those things come together, they know no better than you know. This is actually very much to our advantage as agents. A joined-up knowledge of the future would completely undercut the future of intention. A knowable future presupposes the necessary implication of the future by the present, but the implication of the future by the present implies the implication of the present by the past, and so completely subverts the idea of freedom. The condition of agency is necessarily to know the future only indirectly, through prophecy, through conjecture, to conceive it immediately only as possibility to be realized. In Scripture it is said that even the Son, through whom God acts in history, cannot know the day and the hour. Now, there can occur an intellectual pathology in which the intentions we are actually forming appear so vividly to our imagination as to seem predetermined, so that the future appears to us as factual as the past. And that pathology is beautifully presented to us in Shakespeare's Macbeth. Shakespeare's, of course, not to deprive the historical King Macbeth of Scotland of his honoured place in Scottish history, but this dramatic character we meet in Shakespeare's play has vivid imaginations evoked by the prophecy of the hags on the heath, which creates the illusion for him of being an onlooker on his own projected crime. My thought, he says, whose murder yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise. function is smothered in surmise can be paraphrased as, instead of asking, what shall I do, I ask, what is going to happen? The normal awareness of oneself as a free agent, determining one's actions, has been suspended for him by the vividness of his imagination. The sense of free agency is, of course, often an anxious, even frightening sense. And in an extreme case, we're quite ready to abandon it and to cast ourselves in the role of seers and prophets who can, to a degree, know what is going to happen, but can absolve ourselves from all responsibilities for it, seeing ourselves as simply the onlooking playthings of destiny. So Macbeth thought of himself. However, anticipation of the future does not always take this pathological form. Indeed, we could hardly live and act if it did. We can anticipate without any of this confusion between future and fact. We can think of regularities between events at one time and outcomes at another, such that without any necessary implication of the future by the past, we can speak of predictable tendencies. Anticipated futures are founded on the order of the world as we may know it, and they're constructed out of regularities that we can observe. We entertain many such, and of various kinds. Some of them are instinctive, shaped by fear or aspiration. Some are calculated carefully on the basis of proven laws of nature. There's so much order to observe in the world around us, so much to extrapolate from, that it is very easy for the imagination to construct anticipations, and as we see, the Hong Kong-Shanghai Banking Corporation freely indulges in this power. But precisely for these reasons, our imaginations constantly contradict and trip one another up. We can easily fear two incompatible things at one time, and it's insuperably difficult to draw them together to make a plausible whole. Dystopian or utopian pictures of a total future are valuable as witnesses to our fears and to our hopes, but they are not witnesses to likely outcomes. Those who draw even limited predictions together to form pictures of the future find they can market them at astonishingly high prices. Why is that? Because they offer, or seem to offer, a firmer purchase for forming intentions. A totalized concept of utility, with its idea of action as objectively productive of transparent ends, needs a very strong function of anticipation. We can hardly object to that as such. To the extent that anticipation is soberly possible, it should presumably be allowed, as well as any other information we have about the present, to inform our intentions. So what scope is there for a critique of our anticipation of the future? Let's quickly rule out two libels. First, anticipation does not imply a total future as knowable. That would destroy the concept of utility to which it seems to be offering support. Utility is a practical idea that, like every other practical idea, needs freedom, and as such needs to hold the door of the future open and not treat it as closed. Second, anticipation does not need to run on infinitely into the future. A great deal of nonsense has been spoken and written about the consequences of each act running indefinitely into the future ad infinitum. An infinity of anticipation would make practical reason quite blind. And utilitarianism certainly does not suppose such a thing. The consequences of any act are finite because the act itself is finite. It will very soon be overwhelmed by other acts which will be performed by other people. Rational action, then, conceived on the lines of utility as well as on other lines, recognizes the limits of what it can effect. No sensible purpose can be formed unless we purge the intention of a universe of possible future events which we may dream about or worry about, but cannot and should not be allowed to determine our action or enter into any kind of practical reflection. But if utilitarianism does not require a total anticipation or infinite anticipation of the future. It does require a very definite anticipation. It proposes sufficient confidence in the anticipations of any given action as to advise us to consider these and nothing else in our moral reasoning. And the critique that that should attract is that in its fragmentary and conjectural assemblage of intuitions of the future, anticipation simply lacks the definiteness that utilitarianism counts on. But it also lacks the definiteness required to resist its demand. Anticipation offers itself as malleable to intention. It gets sucked into the model of the craftsman's production, which deploys reasonable anticipations that arise from the mastery of material that skill confers. The reason this model, the model of making things, is not universalizable as an account of action is that such skills are specialized in relation to special materials. The woodworker can tell you what happens if you deploy this tool in this way at that point, and can tell you quite sharply. He can't tell you what happens when you apply the same tool to glass. You need a different specialist craftsman to tell you that. There is no overall skill of doing everything. Anticipation, therefore, is open to misrepresentation. Because within specialized contexts we anticipate with some definiteness what follows from what, it is supposed that we can anticipate with equal definiteness what is likely to follow from anything. But what it will really tell us, if we listen to it, is that the most predictable thing about the future is its capacity for surprising us. And that means for disappointing certain apparently well-formed expectations. Behind the small galaxy of planets with predictable courses, there is a vast outer space of the unpredictable or only marginally predictable. Supremely, when we act in a social context, we are in a context of freedom where anticipation is reduced in its scope very considerably to posing intelligent questions. Now, fear of freedom can be at work here too, encouraging us to believe that we know certain things, especially about other people's behavior, which in truth we only wish we knew. And there can arise from this a further confusion of resolution and foresight, which is like a kind of backward version of Macbeth's confusion. Consider the nuclear strategists of the 1960s and 1970s who argued that massive deterrence would certainly keep world peace so long as everyone declared, in tones of scientific objectivity, that it was certain that it would keep world peace. Or consider the economists of the 1990s who, learning, I think, from the deterrence theorists, predicted infinite runaway growth for as long as confidence in infinite runaway growth was sustained by optimistic predictions. Now, how might one describe the rationality of such arguments? I think we would have to simply invert the line from Shakespeare and say, surmise was smothered in function. They asked, what are we to do, when they should have been asking, what is going to happen? Their need to be sure of how humans would behave in completely uncharted circumstances was answered by a naked resolution to make sure. But that is no answer. Putting such plainly diseased examples of public reason aside, we need to grasp the simple logical point that covers every endeavor in this field, that the only terms on which human behavior can be seen as predictable is by abstractions of thought. Homo economicus is predictable man. And of course, Homo economicus is a very entertaining creation of economic theory. The only thing to remember when dealing with this creation is that nobody should imagine that Homo economicus exists in the real world. He is an abstraction. He is a mathematical projection. and as such, a very useful one, I'm sure. Unfortunately, the predictions that can be made for him are so extensive and so definite that they can be seized on as though they were predictions for Homo sapiens, which they're not. Overextended reliance on anticipation in practical thinking creates a demand for definition, which feeds back into a reduced concept of human reactions and interests, so that we take notice of that which we reckon we can definitely anticipate and ignore the rest. Now, this may impact our social decision-making in one or two different ways. There is, in the first place, a banal preference for the short-term focus. In a utilitarian regime of medical services, to come back to issues that more directly concern the Lupina Center, our understanding of good practice is increasingly governed by routine and predictability. I think of a patient who was persuaded to undergo a major cardiac procedure at the age of 89 without a geriatric assessment being made. Why? It's very easy to see why. Cardiac procedures allow these days of reasonably firm short-term predictions. You could be definite about the next 3 months. Geriatric assessments allow no such firm predictions. Consequently, the cardiac prediction trumps the geriatric predictions, such as they are. The geriatric assessment is excluded, and in this case, simply left out. The capacity to predict confers the right to decide. But that capacity depended all the time on a narrowing of focus to that which is essentially predictable, to the processes which most resemble mechanical processes. And one possible social consequence that follows from this is that because most certain utilities are short-term utilities and mechanical utilities, there is a prejudice in favor of mechanical operations with short-term horizons. That is, as it were, the banal consequence that follows from this whole way of thinking. There is, however, an alternative possible consequence, which may arise precisely out of dissatisfaction with the banal one. If decisions are not to be thus narrowed down to short-term technical operations, the assessment of wider consequences has to be represented in the guise of predictable mechanical processes. We demand that the medical professionals widen their scope and take account of geriatric predictions as well as cardiological ones, say. Geriatric predictions are by no means as clear as cardiological predictions. That's not the way geriatric medicine, when well practiced, functions. Never mind, they must pretend to be clear, precisely to suit our generalized conception of what decision-making requires. And so it is that there arises in modern society the constant confusion of speculative anticipation with hard science. Return to the case from which we began, the shelter that's challenged on the grounds that it aids capitalism to escape its social liabilities. I took this objection to the shelter perfectly at face value. It's the kind of thing one hears the whole time, so I trust you will think I have not made it taken a ridiculous example. However, what kind of a prediction is it? What reason have we to trust such a prediction? Is it true that the self-concealment of capitalist liabilities is really a consequence of this act of thoughtfulness and similar acts of thoughtfulness in any interesting way? There's nothing, certainly, in Mill's creed of utility to require us to think so. But we take that objection at face value because we have long since formed the habit of discussing long-term social causes and effects as though they were mechanistically determined. And that habit was formed precisely to help us cope with a world in which definite predictions are the gateway to power. We've created a regulative discourse of deliberation in which everything must give the strongest grounds for anticipating everything else. since if it does not, we would apparently be left in a decision-making vacuum. If consequences or tendencies to produce consequences are the only justification of policy, a habit of doubting the inevitability of consequences has a highly antisocial and anti-political appearance. It makes policy making impossible. Now, it's not, I think, bureaucracy and the habits of bureaucracy that teach us to think in utilitarian ways. On the contrary, it is utilitarianism that teaches us how to govern ourselves bureaucratically. The bureaucracy is an apparatus set up to produce certain anticipations in every field of social policy. Increasingly, we take our frustrations out on it when the impossibility of that exercise becomes more than usually apparent to us. Now, at the heart of the Christian critique of anticipation, expressed in the classical understanding of prudence, is the claim that the intended future does not have to be and should not be governed primarily or uniquely by anticipated futures predicated on technique. In the first place, it opens up some other relations to the future than prediction. In the second place, it opens up a much broader picture of the present. The thought of the future is essential to any kind of practical reason. That is where we began. We cannot do reasonable thinking without the use of some anticipation. Prudence, too, entertains thoughts of the future. Philologically, prudentia is the same as providentia, foresight. It's not an empty habit of speech when we refer to some major deliberative question, such as that of perhaps constitutional change in Scotland, as the future of Scotland. So we should not follow the common objection to the ethics of utility that its focus on the future needs to be replaced by a focus on the present. Oswald Bayer, for example, has argued that the present given to us must be conceived as both pastless and futureless. I don't agree. The thought is, there is one good thing I can do right now. One life I have to live in the present. To let my imagination stray into the future and be enchanted with it is to lose sight of what the present given to me is, and so to be or to do nothing. To that, I think we have to ask in reply, but when will that one good thing I've been given to do be done? Before lunch? When will the one life in the present that I've been given to live be lived? Before death? We cannot even think of the execution of the one immediate thing we have to do without thinking into the future. Now is the moment of deliberation in which I find myself, and deliberation forces me to look forward. Lunch and death are both in the future. So is the between now and lunch of the act I have to perform, and the between now and death of the life I have to live. Conscious action demands a future. It takes time, and the present has no length, no extension of its own. Here and now is not a measurable duration of time. And so action steps forward in time towards a future that forms the immediate prospect, as one might step into a boat from the quay. St. Paul, in a phrase that is much misunderstood, I think, speaks of good works which are prepared before that we should walk in them, i.e. prepared before us, prepared in front of us, before our feet, as a path that we can walk in. But grant that the future of intention is indeed a future and not a present, how does it stand in relation to other futures? Here we should be reminded of a relation to the future which we have not mentioned yet and which we may have forgotten, and that is hope. And we may have forgotten it because we thought of freedom as simply creative of the future, making it. Creative within certain constraints of necessity, of course, including those of event and consequence, but essentially producing the good that the future is to hold. Prudence is in a position to remind us that the good may be given to us from the purposes of God for the future, and that that future may be creative of the present, and not vice versa. It's to that that we respond with hope. God's purpose, to become more overtly theological here, is accessible to knowledge to the extent that it is offered us as promise. It's not anticipated on the basis of a projection from any imminent regularity. The kingdom of God is not coming with observation, as Jesus once said. The object of hope, St. Paul reminds us, is what we do not see. At the same time, hope is not interested in the sheerly and absolutely impossible. Hope conceives the outline of a future good which it cannot describe, for which it cannot give a sufficient reason based on prediction, yet which bears on the present as a horizon to which it is open, a new possibility. I hope for things I cannot anticipate. I hope for deep changes in the world, when the lion shall lie down with the lamb. To say that these changes are simply possible is wrong. It's a banal flattening of hope into anticipation. To say that they're impossible is wrong. They are beyond the scope of possibility and impossibility. They are transformations to which a world of carnivorous lions and edible lambs is, we are encouraged to believe, somehow open, and to which we may look. There's no speculative finality here, no final coherence to the fragmentary and conjectural anticipations we win from the present. But if we hope, Paul goes on, we may expect and endure. And here is the point of connection between hope and prudence, which brings us back from new possibilities of the future to imminent possibilities of the present world, and to the immediate future which lies directly before our feet. Prudence permits us, in conceiving the world's ultimate future, to find a space for freedom cleared before our feet, even if that space is no larger than allows for patient waiting, which is, of course, also a very important exercise of freedom. Without hope, there can be no prudence, for hope, to recall the famous mixed metaphor, is the anchor within the veil. It offers us the one thing about the future to which we may trust, and so allows us to act in the knowledge that whatever else is uncertain about the future, it holds the coming of the Son of Man. And so prudence conducts its search outside the veil, this side of the veil, looking for a defined space, not a yawning void of possibility, but a defined space that will be in line with and point to the outline of the promise of the kingdom of God. I have devoted most of my time to speaking about a critique of the thought of the future. Let me conclude now with very few words on a critique of the present, a critique of recollection. The future horizon of action is a horizon of the present in which we deliberate, and we can grasp it only in relation to that other horizon of the present, which is the past horizon, that which constitutes the present as it is. A forward-looking intention must be linked to a backward-looking memory. That was Augustine's recipe for prudence. To be an opening for action, a possibility that presents itself on the future horizon must be a possibility for the world in which the agent has come to be situated, the world that has taken shape on the past horizon of the present. Action initiates, but it initiates upon some state of affairs. It answers and must answer truthfully to what is really the case. Not merely affirming, perpetuating a state of affairs that has come to be, for it may criticize it or modify it, but at least referring correctly to that state of affairs. So, to plot revolution today against the King of France is neither radical nor conservative, merely dissociated from reality. Any revolution we plot must be related to something that is the case that we have rightly assessed and evaluated. To cite initiative within reality is what we call deliberation. The world in which initiative is cited is a world of regularities. That was the perception that lay at heart of the utilitarian proposal, and we should not deny Mill the credit for firmly believing in moral regularities too, even though he thought they could be fully accounted for as perspicuous tendencies to produce happiness. Deprived of that way of understanding them, we may turn back to a moment in classical prudence called synderesis, the comprehending of the moral regularities seen not only as an order of cause and effect, not only as an order of value, but as an order of action in terms of principles of action. The world in which initiative is cited is not only a world of regularities, but a world of particulars, in which new events are new, not repetitions of other older events. And prudence is exercised not only in grasping the principles, but in understanding the unique moment that has come to presence for us, which opens up our moment of action in the future. And this was the function that was classically named conscientia, the formation of concrete judgment. And this is not simply an act of classification. A wise tradition, going right back to Thomas Aquinas, has understood that the moral character of an act is determined not only by its classification as a performance, but by its setting, by its circumstances, as moral philosophy has traditionally labeled them. And it is in this context that prudence can take account, among other circumstances, of tendencies that may inhere in acts. Now, prudence is concerned with achieving a sufficiently rich account of the present moment within which any decision has to be exercised. And we've understood care as a relation of support with the needy patient. Care is not addressed to the needs of the patient alone, though the needs may be what attracts the care. It's addressed to the person who has the needs. And to that extent, it's an attitude in which the fullest recognition of the complex reality that presents itself is required, both its generic character and its particular character. Medical care engages with this patient, not with all patients. Yet it engages with this patient on an understanding that this patient presents needs of a certain type that can be recognized, classified, for which there is also a generic type of response. And both these aspects, we note, are implied in speaking of the humanity of the patient. Addressing the humanity of the patient involves noting the elements of regularity and the elements of freedom. So why is caring for somebody not the same as producing that person's happiness? Because happiness, as we've already said, is always an object of inquiry. And to serve that happiness implies recognizing the role that the freedom of the other must play in looking for it. It's not ours to produce. Yet we can engage in care with a reasonable hope and an expectation of facilitating another person's search for happiness, since human beings are human beings, and certain conditions are generically conducive to searching for and finding happiness, while others are much less conducive. Finally, and here I close, prudence is exercised in linking up the space open for action now with the history that lies behind that action. Our initiatives are new beginnings, never new creations. They carry forward a legacy of decisions already made, actions already performed. And just as the decision we make now will bequeath a legacy of expectation for our future conduct, so we find ourselves committed, when we come to act, to expectations and policies formed already through past decisions. We never absolutely act de novo. Sometimes in this connection we speak of ideals and compromises. Ideals being the longer-term purposes we form with greater or lesser self-awareness to guide our decisions in the future, and compromises as the adjustments we make to the performance as the course of events does not allow the implementation in full precisely as we anticipated. Now, when we make compromises, what we compromise with, it must be clear, is our own policy, our ideal. We do not compromise with the moral order itself or with moral laws framed on the basis of the moral order. Compromise is not the right term to describe the process of moral learning, which involves changing our minds about things or gaining a new or better understanding of moral principles. The adjustments we make when we make compromises are made to our own projections, the ways in which we had thought to respond to the moral order and to moral rules. And as there are good ideals and bad ideals, there are good compromises and bad compromises. Some ideal purposes were never realistic, some were never even just and right. And the best thing we can do is abandon them. But there are good ideals which can be served by good compromises. Amending the execution of a policy without abandoning it, keeping an ideal practicable in evolving and changing circumstances. Not every compromise is good. Not every difficulty in implementing a purpose ought to send us scuttling away from that purpose. To judge what is possible is often far from straightforward. And in great enterprises, courage and daring is always needed. But a good ideal is, when all is said and done, a possible ideal. And a good compromise focuses the attention precisely on where that possibility lies and how that ideal might be turned into action in the given circumstances of the present. The anxiety that presents itself over the relation between a forward-looking utility and a backward-looking care often turns, in fact, on how we may distinguish good compromises from bad ones. I shall close there. I have kept you patiently waiting too long and have realized that my ideas have slightly overrun the scope I had allowed for them, so my compromise is not to try and finish off everything I had prepared to say. And I hope you will agree that that at least is a very good compromise. Let me